The cell was small and dark, lit only by a single blue light that blinked like a dying star. Cold air filled the metal room, carrying the smell of rust and pain. In the corner sat a young alien girl, her wrists bound by glowing silver chains. Her skin shimmered faintly, a soft blue that once symbolized life on her home world, but now it only reminded her of her captivity. She had no name anymore. The soldiers who kept her here called her Specimen 4. To them, she was not a person, not even a voice, just an object locked away. Sometimes she wondered if the stars outside even remembered her face. She had been in that cage for so long that time had lost its meaning. Every day began with footsteps, harsh voices, and the sound of energy doors sliding open. They brought her strange food and asked cruel questions. They wanted to know about her people, her powers, her world. She answered nothing, because she no longer believed that anyone in this galaxy cared. But deep inside, a small piece of her heart still whispered the same word, freedom. That word was the only thing that kept her alive. When she closed her eyes, she remembered the fields of her planet, glowing rivers and floating gardens. She remembered laughter, songs, and her mother's voice telling her to be brave. And then the sky had turned red, the ships had come, and everything she loved had burned. Now, she sat in silence, the cold walls around her reflecting her loneliness. Her hands trembled each time the guards passed by, their armor shining, their eyes empty. Sometimes they joked about selling her to the black markets. Sometimes they called her a pet. The words hurt, but she never cried in front of them. She would not give them her tears. Then one day, the sound changed. Instead of the usual guard footsteps, she heard explosions, distant but growing. The lights flickered red. Alarms echoed through the corridors. The ship was under attack. Her heart raced. She pressed her ear against the metal door, trying to hear what was happening. Voices shouted orders, energy weapons fired, and then everything went silent. For a long moment, she stayed still, afraid to hope, afraid to move. Then the door hissed open with a slow metallic groan. Smoke drifted in, and through the mist, a figure appeared. It was not one of her captors. His armor was different, worn and scratched. A symbol she didn't recognize glowed faintly on his chest, blue and white. He looked around cautiously, his weapon ready, and then his eyes fell on her. The girl shrank back into the corner, thinking he was just another soldier come to take her away. But this man didn't raise his gun, he lowered it. He stepped closer, slowly, his expression filled not with cruelty, but with shock and pity. He spoke softly, his voice deep and calm. "It's okay, you're safe now." The girl didn't understand the words, but she felt their warmth. The man knelt beside her, looking at the glowing chains around her wrists. He pulled out a small plasma cutter from his belt, the blade humming quietly. The girl gasped, trying to pull away, but he shook his head gently. "Easy, I'm not here to hurt you," he said again, pointing to the chains. He sliced through the metal, sparks flying in the dim light. For a second, she didn't breathe, afraid this was another dream. Then the final chain snapped with a loud crack, and her arms fell free. She stared at her hands, trembling, unable to believe it. The human smiled faintly. "You're free," he whispered. The words were simple, but they hit her heart like a sunrise after endless night. She looked at him, this strange being with brown eyes and battle scars, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Outside, the alarms began again, and heavy footsteps echoed through the halls. The man turned quickly, his eyes sharp. "We need to move," he said, grabbing her hand. For a moment she hesitated. The world beyond that door still frightened her. But then she looked back at her empty chains and took his hand. As they ran down the corridor, the cold wind from the ruptured vents brushed her face. It felt strange and alive, like the first breath of freedom she had forgotten. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder. But she didn't look back, not anymore. For the first time, she ran towards something instead of away from it. And though she didn't know his name yet, she knew one thing for certain. This human had broken more than her chains. He had broken the silence in her soul. The alarms echoed through the massive warship like thunder rolling through a stormy sky. Red lights flashed across the metal walls, painting everything in shades of danger and fear. Raiden held the alien girl's trembling hand as they ran through the narrow corridors. Her bare feet slapped against the cold floor, her breath short and fast, each inhale filled with terror and disbelief. Behind them, distant shouts of soldiers mixed with the screeching hum of security drones. Raiden's communicator crackled with voices demanding his status, but he turned it off. He had already crossed a line that no soldier was supposed to cross. In rescuing her, he had betrayed his mission, his command, maybe even his entire species. They reached a maintenance shaft, hidden behind broken panels. Raiden pulled her inside, covering her with his cloak as patrol lights swept past the hallway. For a long moment they stayed silent. The only sound was her quiet breathing. The girl looked at him with wide glowing eyes, still trying to understand what was happening. He whispered softly, "You're safe, I promise." Even though he wasn't sure it was true, he looked down at her wrists where the chains had burned her skin raw. Her veins glowed faintly beneath the surface, not human, but heartbreakingly beautiful. He couldn't understand why anyone would lock up something so innocent. In his years of war, he had seen planets burn. He had seen cruelty from every species, including his own. But never before had he felt such anger, such guilt for being part of it. He remembered the moment he first saw her in that cell, the way she didn't even move, didn't even flinch. She had already accepted pain as her world, and that thought haunted him. He took a small scanner from his wrist, checking the ship's map. They were deep inside enemy territory. The only exit was through the upper hangar. He had to reach his dropship before the enemy sealed the blast doors. He looked back at the girl, realizing she didn't even know his name. "Raiden," he said, placing his hand on his chest. "My name is Raiden." She blinked slowly, repeating it softly, "Raiden." Her voice was fragile but melodic, like a forgotten song trying to find its tune. Hearing her speak made him smile, and for a moment, the chaos outside disappeared. Then a sudden explosion shook the floor, dust falling from the ceiling. Raiden grabbed her arm. "We have to move," he said quickly. As they slipped through another corridor, the ship's defense AI activated, mechanical voices warning intruders to surrender. A drone spotted them, red sensors flashing, and fired a plasma shot that barely missed their heads. Raiden spun, his rifle glowing blue, and fired a burst that tore the drone apart. The alien girl flinched at the sound, covering her ears. He turned to her and said, "Stay close, don't look back." She nodded, trusting him completely now. As they reached a service door, she suddenly stopped, pointing toward the walls. Her eyes glowed brighter, and the lights around them flickered. For a second, Raiden thought she was afraid, but then realized she was doing something. Her voice trembled as she whispered words in a language he couldn't understand. The electronic lock on the door sparked, then clicked open. Raiden stared, astonished. "You did that?" She only gave a faint smile, the first hint of pride he'd seen in her. They ran inside the next chamber, a cold storage bay filled with metal crates and glowing tubes. Raiden sealed the door behind them, breathing heavily. He slumped against the wall, trying to think, his mind racing between orders, guilt, and instinct. He knew what awaited him if he returned to his fleet: court-martial, imprisonment, or worse. But if he stayed here, he'd die, and so would she. He looked at her again, sitting quietly on the floor, tracing the marks on her wrists. There was something in her eyes, a strength he couldn't explain, as if she had already survived more than anyone should. He walked over and knelt beside her. "I can't take you back," he said quietly. "They'll just cage you again." She didn't understand every word, but she heard the sorrow in his voice. He took her hand gently. "I'll find another way," he promised. She looked at him with trust so deep it almost broke him. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps echoed closer. Raiden tightened his grip on his weapon, ready to fight. He wasn't sure why he was risking everything for someone he had just met. But deep inside, something told him this moment mattered more than his orders. Maybe it was because he saw himself in her eyes, a prisoner of duty, bound by invisible chains. The door began to rumble, soldiers shouting on the other side. Raiden looked at her. "Stay behind me," he said firmly. When the door burst open, he fired with precision, every shot fueled by defiance. The girl covered her head, but when she opened her eyes again, the room was silent. Raiden stood there, smoke rising from his rifle, his expression calm but resolute. He turned to her and said softly, "We're not going back." And in that moment, the human soldier and the alien slave became fugitives together. Not by chance, but by choice. And though neither of them knew it yet, that choice would change the fate of more than just their lives. It would shake the entire galaxy. The air inside the warship grew hotter, thick with smoke and sparks, alarms screaming through every deck. Raiden pulled the alien girl through the chaos, his heartbeat echoing with the same rhythm as the warning sirens. The corridors twisted like a maze, walls shaking as explosions rocked the ship from the outside. The entire vessel trembled, hit by something massive, probably human assault ships trying to breach the hull. He knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the enemy sealed off the hangar or vented the lower decks into space. The girl stumbled beside him, weak but determined, her glowing eyes darting everywhere. She didn't know where they were going, but she held tightly to his hand. For the first time, someone was leading her toward freedom instead of pain. Raiden stopped at a junction, opening his visor map. The hangar was 2 levels up. He cursed softly under his breath. No elevators, no lifts, no time, he muttered. He looked around, spotting a vertical shaft leading upward, its maintenance ladder still intact. He turned to her. "Can you climb?" he asked, pointing to it. The girl tilted her head, confused by the word, but when he motioned with his hands, she nodded. They began the climb, the metal rungs cold under their fingers, smoke rising below them. Halfway up, the ship lurched violently, sending dust and debris cascading through the shaft. Raiden nearly lost his grip, but the girl reached out and steadied him, her touch glowing faintly. They made it to the top and crawled into a dimly lit corridor. The sounds of battle echoed from somewhere distant, gunfire, screams, the roar of engines. Raiden knew his comrades were fighting outside, unaware that he was now the enemy. He didn't care anymore. His mission wasn't about orders, it was about her. They reached the hangar door, but it was locked behind a thick blast shield. Raiden typed furiously into the control pad, but the screen flashed access denied. He slammed his fist against it in frustration, sparks flying. The girl stepped forward silently, placing her glowing palm over the panel. A surge of energy pulsed through the console, blue light flooding the screen. The metal doors groaned, then slowly began to rise. Raiden turned to her, shocked again. "You can control their systems," he whispered. She nodded weakly, her voice trembling. "I was made to obey their machines." The hangar was a massive cavern of steel and shadow, ships burning, drones firing at anything that moved. Raiden ducked behind a cargo container, pulling the girl with him. "Stay down," he said, scanning the chaos, trying to spot his stolen dropship on the far side. It was there, smoking, half-damaged, but still powered. They ran, moving from cover to cover, every step echoing against the metal floor. A drone spotted them, firing a volley of plasma shots that seared the air beside them. Raiden dove, rolling to the side, and fired back, his rifle humming with heat. The drone exploded, scattering burning fragments across the deck. The girl flinched at the blast, covering her ears. Raiden grabbed her shoulders gently. "You're doing great. Almost there," he said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the fire around them like shattered stars. They reached the dropship just as another explosion tore through the hangar wall. Raiden jumped into the cockpit, hands moving quickly across the control panel. The engines sputtered to life, blue energy flaring through the thrusters. "Hold on," he said, glancing at her. "This is going to be rough." The girl gripped the seat tightly, her heart racing as the ship began to rise. Then, a sudden voice crackled through the comm system. "Unit 9, stand down immediately, you're aiding the enemy." Raiden recognized it. It was his commanding officer, General Voss. "Raiden, if you take off, you'll be branded a traitor, you'll lose everything." Raiden stared at the controls, his finger hovering over the ignition. His eyes flicked to the girl, sitting quietly, watching him with fear and hope mixed together. Her chains might be gone, but if he stopped now, she'd be captured again. He took a deep breath and whispered, "Then I guess I'll lose everything." He slammed the throttle forward, the dropship shooting up through the hangar with blinding speed. Flames and debris chased them as the hangar doors burst open. Outside, the stars stretched endlessly before them, cold and bright. The ship broke free of the warship's gravity, spinning slightly as the shockwave hit. Raiden steadied the controls, breathing heavily. The girl looked out the window. her eyes wide as the endless void unfolded before her. She had never seen the stars so close, so alive. Her lips parted as she whispered a single word, home, even though she no longer had one. Raiden smiled faintly, looking at her through the cockpit light. "We'll find you one," he said softly. In that moment, amid the chaos of war and fire, something unspoken formed between them. Two souls, one human, one alien, bound not by chains, but by choice. As the dropship vanished into the darkness of space, the alarms behind them faded. The galaxy didn't know it yet, but something powerful had just begun. Not the fall of an empire, not the rise of a rebellion, but the birth of a promise. A promise that humanity's kindness could still change the stars. The stars stretched like silver dust outside the dropship's window. For the first time, there was silence, not the kind filled with fear or orders, but a quiet that felt alive. Raiden set the ship on autopilot, his hands trembling slightly from exhaustion. They had escaped, but the cost of what he had done was only beginning to sink in. The alien girl sat near the window, staring at the glowing void. Her fingers traced the glass, following the slow drift of nebula clouds. Her chains were gone, yet her mind still felt bound by years of captivity. Raiden watched her carefully, noticing how she flinched at sudden noises, how she never turned her back fully to him. He didn't blame her. She had every reason not to trust anyone, especially another soldier. He took off his helmet, revealing a tired but kind face, his short hair matted with sweat and smoke. He spoke softly, "You're safe now," though the words felt small compared to what she'd endured. The girl tilted her head, trying to understand. She still didn't know much of his language, but she could sense the tone in his voice. It was the first time someone had spoken to her without cruelty. She pointed at herself hesitantly. "Corinne," she said, her voice fragile but proud. Raiden smiled faintly. "Corinne," he repeated, letting her name rest on his tongue like a promise. For a moment, the universe felt smaller, just the two of them floating in it. He gave her a blanket, some water, and a ration pack. She sniffed the food suspiciously before taking a small bite, her face softening in surprise. Raiden chuckled quietly. "Not poison," he said, and she almost smiled. They traveled for hours through the cold dark, avoiding patrol routes and scanning for safe zones. Eventually, Raiden found a small asteroid outpost hidden in the shadow of a broken moon. It was an old human mining base, abandoned decades ago. He landed the ship carefully, its engines dimming into silence. Inside the outpost, the air was stale but breathable. Raiden set up a few lamps, their golden light flickering across cracked metal walls. Karin looked around cautiously, touching the rusted tools, the faded symbols. It wasn't much, but to her, it was the first place that didn't feel like a cage. Days passed in quiet rhythm. Raiden repaired the dropship, while Karin explored the small corridors. She began to learn words: food, sleep, safe, sky, each one carrying a new piece of meaning. Sometimes she'd point at things and ask, her eyes bright with curiosity. Raiden would smile and teach her patiently, and though they spoke in fragments, they understood each other perfectly. One evening, as the artificial sun lamp dimmed, Karin sat near the heater, humming softly. It was a tune from her home, a sound filled with longing. Raiden listened quietly, the melody haunting yet peaceful. When she noticed him watching, she stopped, embarrassed, but he shook his head gently. "Don't stop," he said. "It's beautiful." For the first time since her rescue, she laughed, a soft, trembling sound that filled the empty room with life. That moment changed something between them. They were no longer a soldier and a prisoner, but two lost souls finding warmth in each other's silence. Still, Raiden knew this peace wouldn't last. He had broken military law, and sooner or later, someone would come looking. He often stared at his communicator, seeing the blinking red signal of unacknowledged orders. He had become a ghost in the system, erased from the records but hunted in secret. Karin noticed his worry. One night, she placed her hand on his arm and whispered a single human word she'd learned: "Stay." He looked at her, surprised, then nodded slowly. "I'll stay," he promised. Her eyes softened, and she smiled. A real smile this time, pure and alive. Later that night, as Raiden drifted into uneasy sleep, Karin stood near the window, staring at the stars. Memories of her people flooded back. Their faces, their songs, their cries for help. She couldn't rest knowing others were still suffering as she once did. A tear slid down her cheek, glowing faintly under the dim light. She turned to look at Raiden, sleeping near the console, his armor still scarred from battle. He had risked everything for her, a stranger from another world. Now she wanted to do the same. But deep down, she feared what would happen if she told him. When morning came, Raiden found her sitting quietly beside him, her expression troubled. He offered her water and asked, "Nightmare?" She nodded slightly, then whispered another word she had just learned. "Others." Raiden froze, realizing what she meant. There were more prisoners, more like her, still out there. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "You want to go back," he said softly. She nodded again, determination burning in her glowing eyes. Raiden stared at her in silence, torn between reason and heart. He knew what returning meant: danger, betrayal, death, but he also saw the fire in her soul. The fire that said she was done being a victim. He finally sighed, leaning back against the wall. "Then we'll need a plan," he said, his voice steady. Karin looked at him with surprise, then hope. And when she smiled, it was the kind of smile that made the stars outside seem just a little brighter. The quiet days on the asteroid outpost ended the moment Karin said that one word again: others. From that moment, peace became a memory, replaced by planning, scheming, and the quiet hum of fear beneath determination. Raiden sat by the console, maps and star charts spread before him, the blue glow of the hologram reflecting in his tired eyes. He had risked everything to free one alien slave, and now she was asking him to go back into the jaws of death. He wanted to say no, to tell her it was impossible, but when he looked at her face, he couldn't. Karin was no longer the trembling girl from the cage. Her gaze had strength. Her posture carried quiet authority. There was something in her now, a spark that made Raiden believe she wasn't meant to be saved, she was meant to lead. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly, and Karin nodded, her voice calm but heavy. "They need us." Raiden rubbed his temples, exhaling slowly. "All right, then we do it smart," he said. He started reconfiguring the dropship systems, disguising its transponder signal as an enemy patrol unit. Karin watched, curious, asking questions in her broken but improving English. She learned fast, and sometimes, when he wasn't looking, she adjusted the ship's settings with eerie precision. It was as if she could feel the technology, a remnant of her connection to the machines that once enslaved her. After 2 days of preparation, they were ready. Raiden loaded weapons, recharged the shields, and prepared cloaking fields. Karin packed small energy cells and strange metallic shards she had taken from the outpost. When Raiden asked about them, she only smiled faintly. "Old tools, from my people." The dropship left the asteroid's shadow and slipped into the cold expanse of space. The journey back to the enemy ship was silent, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Through the viewport, the broken silhouette of the warship loomed in the distance. It had survived the last battle, now orbiting a barren moon, its lights faint but alive. Karin's hands trembled slightly as she stared at it. That place was her nightmare, her prison, and yet she was going back willingly. Raiden reached over, placing his hand on hers. "We'll get them out," he said quietly. She nodded, gripping his fingers tightly, her glowing eyes reflecting both fear and fire. They approached under stealth, the ship's cloak flickering in the magnetic haze. Raiden maneuvered through the debris field, dodging broken hull fragments. When they docked at an auxiliary port, the airlock hissed open with a cold metallic sigh. Karin took a deep breath, stepping onto the ship that had once stolen her life. The corridors were empty but familiar. Every sound echoed like a ghost from her memories. She led Raiden through maintenance tunnels, her memory guiding them with uncanny accuracy. When they reached the lower cell decks, she froze, listening, her head tilting slightly. "They're still here," she whispered, and Raiden felt a chill run through him. He followed her into the containment chamber. Hundreds of glass pods lined the walls, filled with faint blue light. Inside them were beings from different worlds, weak, sleeping, forgotten. Karin's hands shook as she touched the glass of the nearest pod, whispering words in her native tongue. Her voice was gentle, filled with sorrow, and the pod's light flickered as if responding to her touch. Suddenly, a loud alarm burst through the silence, red lights flashing across the ceiling. Security breach detected. A mechanical voice droned through the speakers. Raiden cursed, raising his weapon. We're out of time. Karin stepped forward, her expression calm despite the chaos. No, she said firmly. Time is ours. She placed her palms against the central control pillar. Electric currents surged through her veins, her markings glowing brighter and brighter. The lights in the chamber flickered violently, and the metal collars on the captives began to spark. Raiden watched in stunned silence as Karin's voice rose, singing in that same haunting language he had heard before. One by one, the pods hissed open, their occupants gasping awake. The collars fell from their necks, clattering to the floor, the sound echoing like chains breaking across the universe. Raiden ran to help one of them stand, a frail alien child who stared at him in confusion and wonder. It's okay, he said softly. You're free. Karin stumbled slightly, the glow fading from her skin. Raiden rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. Easy, he whispered. You did it. She smiled weakly, whispering, Not yet. More footsteps thundered down the corridor. Guards, drones, reinforcements. Raiden readied his rifle, but before he could fire, the freed captives stood beside him. Their eyes burned with the same light Karin carried, a unity he didn't understand but felt deep inside. Karin lifted her head, her voice steady. We fight together. And for the first time in centuries of slavery, the halls of the warship rang not with screams, but with defiance. Humans and aliens side by side, fighting as one. Raiden fired into the wave of drones, his shots precise, while Karin raised her hands, unleashing waves of electric force. Every blast of her energy carried the fury of generations silenced by cruelty. The battle was fierce, chaotic, but their resolve was unbreakable. As the last drone fell, the silence returned, heavy and powerful. Raiden turned to Karin, who stood at the center of the room, her eyes glowing like stars. The collars lay shattered around her feet, a sea of broken chains glinting in the flickering light. And for the first time since the war began, hope breathed again in the void. But Raiden knew it wasn't over, not yet. Freedom had been born, but freedom always demanded a price. Smoke and fire filled the corridors as the last of the drones fell. The once mighty warship now echoed with the cries of the newly freed, their chains lying shattered across the metallic floor. Raiden's breathing was heavy, his armor scorched, his weapon glowing faintly from overuse. Karin stood beside him, her glowing eyes dimming, her energy nearly spent. They had done it, but freedom had come with a cost. The ship's alarms blared again, the core overheating, warning lights flashing crimson across every wall. Raiden looked around, realizing the ship was about to self-destruct. He turned to Karin, shouting above the noise. We need to get everyone out now. Karin nodded, calling to the freed prisoners in her native tongue. Her voice carried strength even as it trembled. They moved quickly, helping each other, carrying the weak toward the escape hangar. But as they reached the final passage, a metallic barrier slammed down between them, sealing the way forward. Raiden cursed, slamming his fists against the barrier. On the other side, Karin turned back, eyes wide with fear. The heat from the engines roared beneath them, the air shimmering with rising flames. Go, he shouted. Take them and run. She shook her head, tears streaking down her face. No, not without you. Raiden raised his voice again. You can still save them, Karin, you have to. He turned toward the control console, sparks flying as he began to override the manual locks. The metal was burning hot, his gloves melting, but he didn't stop. Behind him, Karin's voice cracked. Why are you doing this? Raiden smiled faintly, though pain flickered in his eyes. Because someone once told me that freedom begins with a choice. He hit the final command, forcing the barrier to lift halfway, just enough for the others to crawl through. Karin ran toward him, reaching out, but the console exploded, throwing her backward with a flash of light. She fell hard, her vision spinning, and when it cleared, she saw Raiden lying on the ground, motionless. She crawled to him, her trembling hands pressing against his chest. His armor was cracked, his breathing shallow, but he managed to open his eyes. Hey, he whispered weakly. Looks like we made it. Karen shook her head, tears falling like glowing drops of light. No, stay with me. He smiled faintly, lifting a trembling hand to touch her face. You're free now. That's all that matters. She grabbed his hand, pressing it to her heart. You freed more than me, Raiden. You freed us all. The ground shook violently, the ship's engines reaching critical meltdown. Karen looked around, realizing there was no time left. Her hands began to glow again, brighter than before, energy surging through her veins like lightning. Raiden's eyes widened weakly. What are you doing? He whispered. She looked at him, determination replacing fear, finishing what you started. She stood, spreading her arms wide, her voice rising in a language that vibrated through the metal itself. The lights flickered, and the air seemed to bend around her. A wave of pure energy exploded outward, stopping the flames, freezing time for a heartbeat. Raiden felt the heat fade away, the roaring engines silenced. Karin's body floated above the floor, surrounded by a halo of glowing particles. Her markings burned like starlight, her hair lifting in the unseen current of her power. The freed prisoners watched in awe as she absorbed the energy of the core itself. With one final surge, she sent it away, into the void. The explosion that should have destroyed the ship instead burst outward in a silent wave of light. When the glow faded, the warship was gone, replaced by drifting fragments that sparkled like dust in sunlight. On a nearby moon's surface, the freed prisoners awoke under the open stars. Karin lay among them, motionless at first, her skin faintly glowing. Raiden lay beside her, alive but unconscious, his armor cracked and burned. The others gathered around, whispering prayers of gratitude to both of them. As dawn broke across the silent horizon, Karin stirred, her eyes opening slowly. The sky above her was filled with the faint trail of light from the destroyed ship. She turned her head toward Raiden, his hand still resting near hers. A soft smile crossed her lips. You lived, she whispered, her voice breaking with relief. He didn't answer, still deep in exhausted sleep. Karin sat up, looking at the freed survivors, hundreds of them, from dozens of worlds. They looked at her with reverence, not as a captive, but as a savior. She felt the weight of that gaze, and yet her heart only thought of the human who had given everything to make it possible. She turned to the rising sun, her voice soft but filled with promise. No more chains, she whispered. Never again. The survivors raised their heads, their voices joining hers in quiet unity. And as the first rays of light touched her face, Karin felt something new, something that was both hers and human. Hope. The asteroid colony was quiet under the twin suns. The survivors moved slowly, their faces pale but free. Karin stood on a raised platform, overlooking the small gathering of aliens from countless worlds. Her glowing blue skin reflected the sunlight, and her eyes burned with the memory of the chains she had once worn. Raiden sat nearby, leaning against a metal railing, his armor repaired but still scarred from battle. He watched silently as Karin spoke to the crowd, her voice carrying authority, hope, and courage. She told them the story of their escape, of freedom, and of the human who had risked everything for them. Even those who did not understand the language felt her words, the power behind them. Do not forget, she said. The chains of the past are heavy, but together we are stronger. The crowd murmured in agreement, and some raised their hands toward the sky in silent promise. Karin turned to Raiden, who offered a small smile in return. She had become more than a survivor. She had become a leader, a symbol, a spark for the galaxy. Raiden's eyes followed the horizon, where distant ships patrolled cautiously. He had not returned to the fleet. He had not been recognized. Yet here, among these freed souls, he had found something far greater than medals or orders. He had found purpose, and perhaps even family. Later, as the day passed into evening, Karin walked among the survivors. She helped a young alien child repair a damaged hover unit. She comforted an elder whose legs shook from old wounds. She laughed softly with those who had never known joy, and cried quietly for those still lost. Through it all, Raiden remained nearby, offering support, teaching them strategies, sharing his calm presence. That night, Karin sat alone beneath the open sky, the stars stretching endlessly above her. Raiden joined her, sitting silently, letting the quiet embrace them both. She whispered, "Do you think the others will remember what you did?" He shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not, but it doesn't matter." Karen looked at him, surprised. "It does matter to me," she said softly. He smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting starlight. "Then I guess that's enough." In the weeks that followed, the colony flourished. Freed aliens began to rebuild their lives, establishing schools, farms, and workshops. Karen guided them, her leadership steady but kind. Raiden trained volunteers in defense, but he never lost sight of the truth that brought him here. Every freed soul reminded him of why he had broken the rules, why he had risked everything. One morning, Karen stood at the top of the central plaza. She raised her hands, and the crowd fell silent. "From this day forward," she declared, "we remember the human who broke the chains. Not because he was perfect, but because he believed in us when no one else did. Let his courage inspire all of us, and let kindness be stronger than fear." The crowd erupted in cheers, voices carrying across the asteroid, echoing like waves against stone. Karen felt a warmth she had never known in her years of captivity. The galaxy had not changed entirely. There were still wars, still cruelty, still dark corners of space. But here, in this small corner of the universe, freedom had been born. And it would grow because someone had chosen to act, not for power, not for glory, but for compassion. Raiden leaned against the railing, watching Karen, pride and quiet, off filling his heart. He had come here to follow orders, but he had found something greater. The alien girl he had rescued had become a beacon of hope. And together, they had shown that even in the darkest stars, humanity's light could shine. As the twin suns set, painting the colony in gold and violet, Karen placed her hand on Raiden's shoulder, her glow soft but steady. "Thank you," she said simply. He nodded. "No. Thank you for showing me what freedom really means." And beneath the endless sky, among the liberated and the brave, their story lived on, not as a legend written in history books, but as a promise whispered from world to world, that kindness, courage, and humanity could change the galaxy forever.